Welcome to Back to the Bible. In today's study, Bible teacher Bryan Clark shares that while Noah's life is a wonderful illustration of God's salvation for you, it doesn't stop there. You'll want to stay tuned because later in the program, Bryan will join Arnie and Kara in studio to offer some practical ways to share that message of salvation. Now here's Bryan Clark with today's study.
I'm convinced that when Noah and his family went into the ark, if anybody at that moment would have made a decision to follow them into the ark, the door remained open for them. And it wasn't until God closed the door that the day of salvation had come to an end. Now imagine what that would be like for these people who had thought this was such a lark, they thought it was such a joke, they had spent so much time making fun and mocking Noah, just like people do today. They think it's funny that people are going to stand and give an account before God, and they live their lives their own way. And they do just what Adam and Eve did all the way in Genesis chapter 3. We believe that we can be God ourselves and choosing for ourselves what is right and what is wrong. But on that day that the door of the ark closed, they began to understand that there's judgment coming, but it was too late. It was too late to do anything about that. Those are the words of Jesus in Matthew 24. There's some people that need to wake up because God is coming. And the day that he returns and the day of salvation is closed, it will be just as it was in the days of Noah. People will be laughing. People will be carrying on. People will be thinking that this whole idea of God and his judgment is a big joke. Peter talks about that in 2 Peter chapter 3. He refers to Noah and he talks about the impending judgment of God. We want to pick it up in verse 3, 2 Peter 3:3. He says, knowing this, first of all, that in the last days mockers will come, with their mocking, following after their own lust. We have the mockers going all the way back to Moses' story, but we also have this idea of following after their own lust, which is another way of saying from Genesis chapter 3 that they were just deciding for themselves what was right and wrong. They were just doing their own thing with no thought of any accountability. Verse 4, and saying, where is the promise of his coming? For ever since the fathers fell asleep, all continues just as it was from the beginning of creation. This defines what their mocking is about. And their mocking is saying that for all these years, people have been saying that God is a God of judgment, and God will pour out his wrath, and yet they have died, and the next generation has come and died, and we have not seen God, we've not seen God's wrath. Where is this God that's going to come in this judgment? And it's all become a big joke because God hasn't yet come and judged the earth as the preachers of righteousness said that he would. Verse 5, for when they maintain this, it escapes their notice that by the word of God the heavens existed long ago, and the earth was formed out of water and by water, through which the world at that time was destroyed, being flooded with water. Of course, he's referring to the story of Noah there. But the present heavens and earth, by his word, are being reserved for fire, kept for the day of judgment and destruction of ungodly men. But do not let this one fact escape your notice, beloved, that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as 1 day. The Lord is not slow about his promise, as some count slowness, but is patient toward you, not wishing for any to perish, but for all to come to repentance. Noah is saying that while these people are laughing and mocking the reality of God's judgment, he says they fail to realize that it wasn't so long ago that God judged the entire world with this flood. It's the story of Noah. And when he says 1,000 years is like a day to God, he's saying that even though that may seem like such a long time ago to us, to God it was as if he did it yesterday. And God in his heavens is saying, it's like yesterday that I judged the entire earth for their sin. How could these people say that I will not hold them accountable? How can they say that I am not a God of judgment? The evidence is so clear. And yet these people fail to realize that, and they just continue to laugh and they continue to mock. And Peter goes on to say, God's not slow as we count slowness, but he's patient. God is waiting for those people who still need to enter the ark before he sends his judgment. This is a time of mercy, but God still will judge the world when he returns. It's interesting, the following verse then in 10, verse 10 talks about the coming of God will be like a thief in the night. How does a thief come? A thief comes when nobody expects them. A thief comes unexpectedly in the night, and the whole point is to catch people off guard. And both Jesus and Peter are making the same point, and both relaying it back to the story of Noah. That just as those people really didn't believe that God was going to pour out judgment, they were doing their thing, they were considering themselves to be gods, they were indulging in their own lusts. But there came a day when God closed the door of the ark, and it was at that point they realized that Noah had been right. And they, at that point, had no hope, and they would experience the judgment of God. Turn over to Revelation chapter 20, a passage which very clearly defines what that judgment looks like. This is known as the Great White Throne Judgment, and only those who have not entered into God's rest or God's salvation will stand before this judgment. Verse 11, "And I saw a great white throne, and him who sat upon it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, and the great and the small, standing before the throne. And the books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it. And death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every one of them, according to their deeds. And death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire." Look at verse 11 when it talks about when they were in the presence of God, they fled away. Let's take that all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. This battle has been whether or not people will acknowledge God as God or believe ourselves to be God. And these are all people who have determined themselves to be God. They would not respond to God's salvation, but at this moment when God reveals himself to them, all they can do is flee from his presence because he is so terrifying. At that moment, they realize they were not gods at all, and they are giving an account to the God. The problem is at this moment, there is no hope. And when we read through a passage like this and we're reminded of the judgment that is to come, we need to remember these are not people we don't know. These are not people we don't know. These are our neighbors. These are the people that we work with. These are our friends. These are the people that we go to school with. These are people in our own families that do not believe there will ever be such an accountability, that do not believe that God is God, and have refused to enter into his salvation.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Let's return to our study with Bible teacher Bryan Clark.
There is a great emphasis in Genesis chapter 7 on the word enter. It shows up over and over in that passage that Noah entered into the ark. Noah and his family entered into that salvation. And it's a picture that's carried throughout the Old and New Testament that we enter into God's rest. We enter into God's salvation. The alternative is what we just read from Revelation. But the alternative is God's rest. It's the garden of God's grace. It's what he's always wanted. Flip over to Hebrews chapter 4. The writer of Hebrews picks up this concept of rest that began in Genesis 2, is re-emphasized again in Genesis chapter 7. And by the way, in Genesis chapter 5, if you remember, when we were introduced to Noah, we were introduced to Noah's name meaning rest. That Noah would be the one who would bring us rest from the curse of sin, is what's said in Genesis 5. Well, now the writer in chapters 3 and 4 enters into a lengthy discussion about this whole concept of God's rest. He says in verse 3, "For we who have believed enter that rest," but then pick it up in verse 9. "There remains therefore a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall through following the same example of disobedience. This whole concept of God's rest is a contrast with what we read in Revelation 20. Rather than experiencing the lake of fire and the eternal judgment of God, we have the opportunity to enter into God's rest, to enter into his salvation, and to know him in a real and intimate way, to enter into his garden of grace and experience his goodness forever, which is what God has always wanted for us. I want to look at one more passage to make sure this is clear. 1 John chapter 4. To understand, the ark is a picture of the salvation that would be provided through the seed of the woman, and that is the salvation that would come through Jesus Christ, the creator of the universe, the eternal Son of God, who in order to bring us from death back to life, would allow himself to be nailed on a cross in payment for sin, to be buried, rose again the third day, and offers salvation to those who are willing to place their trust in him. The whole idea of rest is this is not something we need to do. It has been done. We simply need to enter into it and experience that salvation. In 1 John chapter 4, he says in verse 9, "By this the love of God was manifested in us, that God has sent his only begotten Son into the world, so that we might live through him. For this is love, not that we loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins." The word propitiation is a word that means God satisfied. Jesus satisfied. He paid the debt in order to satisfy God's standard of holiness so that God could offer forgiveness of sin and salvation and still be a holy God because the debt had been paid. And that's called a propitiation. And Jesus was the one that paid the debt that we might go from death to life. And then in chapter 5, starting in verse 11, "And the witness is this, that God has given us eternal life, and this life is in his Son. He who has the Son has life. He who does not have the Son of God does not have life. These things I have written to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, in order that you may know that you have eternal life." There's nothing else that we need to do. We simply need to believe. By faith, to place our trust in Jesus' death on the cross as payment for our sin, to confess God as God, to confess our own sinfulness, and place our trust in Jesus' death on the cross as the only way of salvation. There is an emphasis in Hebrews chapter 3 when talking about the day of rest, when it says that today is the day to enter into that rest. As a matter of fact, it says, "Enter while it is still today." The reality is the door of the ark is open today, but I cannot tell you it will be open tomorrow. I don't know when God's going to reach down and he's going to close the door of that ark and the day of salvation will be past. But I do know it's still open today for those who choose by faith to enter. There's a poem, it's entitled, "Are All the Children In?" It says, "I think of times as the night draws nigh, of an old house on the hill, of a yard all wide and blossom starred, where the children played at will. And when deep night at last came down, hushing the merry din, mother would look all around and ask, 'Are all the children in?' Many and many a year since then, and the old house on the hill no longer echoes childish feet, and the yard is still, so still. But I see it all as the shadows creep, and though many the years have been, since then I can hear my mother ask, 'Are all the children in?' I wonder if, when those shadows fall on the last short earthly day, when we say goodbye to the world outside, all tired of our childish play, when we meet the lover of boys and girls who died to save them from sin, will we hear him ask, as mother did, Are all the children in? You know, I am convinced that on that day when God reached down and closed the door of that ark, he did so with a tear in his eye and grief in his heart, because that's never what God has wanted. And with a sorrowful heart, he reached down and he closed the door of that ark, because the day of salvation had come to an end. And now he would pour out his judgment for those who fail to acknowledge him as God and accept his way of salvation. You cannot imagine how grieved the heart of God would be if there was just one person in this auditorium this morning who would miss the day of salvation and experience God's judgment and eternal lake of fire. That's not what God wants. It's never what God has wanted. Will you today trust Jesus as Savior and enter into his rest? This poem reminds me of another story. It was told through a series of pictures in a Life magazine years ago. The series of pictures started with a mother standing on the porch of a farmhouse, and she's calling the children in. And you kind of get the imagery that it's dinner time, it's evening, and it's time for the children to come in. The next picture shows several children at her feet, but it's obvious that one child is missing. The next picture shows farm hands and family members looking in various places, trying to find this child. The next picture shows them all huddled on the porch, and the porch light is on, and it's dark outside, and the child is still not there. The next picture shows the sun just coming up, and the whole community of people is gathered there by the porch to look for this child. The next picture shows them all holding hands lined up across a field, walking across a field. And the last picture is like an aerial shot, and it shows the crowd of people gathered together in this field, and they're all gathered in a circle, and you see down in the middle of the circle, and there's the father holding the lifeless body of his child. And the only caption in the entire story is a caption under the last picture that says, "Oh, to God that we'd have joined hands sooner." Are we going to join hands as the people of God to reach the people around us that do not understand that there is a judgment coming? They do not understand that they will be held accountable before God. And if they don't choose his way of salvation, they will be eternally lost. When we look at those people at work tomorrow, and at school tomorrow, and our neighbors, will we see them through eyes that realize these people desperately need a message of hope, or they will be eternally lost? Will we take the time to reach out and do that? Will we take the time to reach out and do that? You see, if we really believe this is true, it changes the way we see people every day. It changes the way we live our lives, and we are compelled, we are motivated that the people around us might know the truth of God's judgment, but God's goodness and his way of salvation. That there one day on an old rugged cross, the creator of the universe gave up his life that we might live with God forever.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. If you'd like to listen again, visit backtothebible.org. That's backtothebible.org. Now Bryan Clark joins us in the studio with author Kara Whitney and Back to the Bible CEO Arnie Cole.
Thanks for your message, Bryan. That account of Noah is an amazing illustration of salvation. In your message, you had a powerful story about joining hands to each of the people around who don't understand that there's a judgment coming. What do you mean by joining hands?
I think within the Church of Jesus Christ, so we're talking about true believers, where there may be differences in certain distinctives, but in the eyes of God, we're his children, the true church. Sometimes we lose sight of the mission. And I think sometimes we're far more passionate about being right than living right. And one thing that's really helpful to think about is the intent of theology is that we might live in a way that brings glory to God. It's not like there's a quiz at the end of the journey and we have to get the quiz right to get in. It's like whatever we believe to be true should affect my life in such a way that I'm conformed more and more to the image of Christ. So I think sometimes as churches, we're so busy arguing and nitpicking and throwing stones at each other. It's kind of like there's a child drowning in the lake, and we're all standing around the lake arguing about the best way to save the child. And you think if you're the parent, you're like, somebody just needs to go in there and save the child.
Right.
And I think sometimes as the church, we're losing sight of the mission of what we're supposed to be about, of what matters to God, and the need to join hands and come together to accomplish the mission. I think that's really important. You know, I graduated from Moody Bible Institute, so we had lots of D.L. Moody stories over the years that I was there. And one story was after one of his revival meetings, a lady confronted him and said she didn't like his method of evangelism.
I know this story. Yeah.
He said, well, ma'am, what's your method? She said, I don't have one. He said, I like mine better than yours.
Yep. I like the way you evangelize better than how you don't evangelize.
Yeah, let's get the job done. Let's stop arguing.
Right.
And let's get the job done.
That's so true. So, Bryan, when we talk to non-believers, we need to let them know there's a judgment. I mean, there's really no way to avoid that, is there?
Yeah, so the reality is there is a judgment, but I think how we have this conversation with unbelievers really matters.
Right.
So if you move away from the 1, 2, 3, 4 presentation, where I've known someone for 5 minutes and I'm already telling them, by the way, you're a sinner and you're headed to hell, it's like that doesn't create a real meaningful conversation. So there has to be a sense in which this is done skillfully. Most people, the gospel intersects people in a point of need in their life. So it could be an illness, it could be loneliness, it could be pain, it could be struggle, it could be emptiness. You know, you think about Jesus with the woman at the well or with Zacchaeus or the rich man. You know, he was so skillful at intersecting into people's lives where it was meaningful to them. And then you advance the conversation. At some point, there is a reality to judgment, and that's why God sent his son to be the savior of the world. But especially in this culture, it's a bit delicate.
Yeah.
And I think it takes a little bit of skill to not just get something said, but to get something heard.
So true.
You're listening to Back to the Bible. We're glad you joined us today. Thank you for listening. Be sure to come back again tomorrow as Bible teacher Bryan Clark leads us into another life-transforming study from God's Word, here on Back to the Bible.